All right, so today we're going to talk about the next trig function to graph, and it's tangent. Okay, and again, anytime, and this is kind of what the tangent graph is going to look like, and we'll talk about why it does. But anytime you're going to graph a function that you don't know what the shape of it is, or what it's going to look like, it's always good to create a t-chart. Okay, x values, and we put the unit circle up here. And because we did, I want to add the tangent values to this. So in the unit circle, we don't write the tangent values down. But we could, and we probably should. It would be helpful. And before we get into the t-chart, I want to write out those values here on the unit circle. So tangent at 0, which is right here, right? Remember that tangent is y over x, or sine over cosine, right? So y over x means that the tangent right here is going to be 0. And I'll put it on the spoke, right? Y over x for pi over 4. And we're including pi over 4 here where we didn't in sine and cosine, because if you look, when you do the tangent, you just get 1. And we can graph 1 pretty easily, right? We didn't graph pi over 4 for sine or cosine because look at those values. Radical 2 over 2 is going to be an irrational number, and it's too hard. We talked about why we didn't include those before. But we can here for tangent because it just ends up being 1. Right? Let's just keep going around. Tangent of pi over 2. Y over x means you're going to get negative 1 over 0, which is actually undefined. That's weird. We haven't seen that before with sine and cosine either, right? But we'll keep going. Tangent of 3 pi over 4, if you go y over x, it's going to give you negative 1. Tangent of pi, give me y over x, which is going to be 0. And then we'll keep going. This is going to be negative 1. This is going to be undefined as well. And, oh, sorry, not negative 1. This is going to be positive 1, sorry. And then this guy right here is going to be negative 1. So there's a couple of things I want you to realize here. First of all, we've got two undefined values here. We've got to figure out what to do with those. The next thing I want you to see is that if you look, and if you go this way, you get 0, 1, undefined, negative 1, 0. Look at what happens when you look at these values right here. You go 0, 1, undefined, negative 1, 0. So it repeats itself already. Now, sine and cosine doesn't repeat itself in a pattern until after you've gone all the way around a circle. So the period for sine and cosine was 2 pi. But the fact that tangent repeats itself before you get to 2 pi, right? It repeats itself on the, I don't know how you want to look at this, the top part here and then the bottom part, means that the period for tangent is going to have to be a little bit different. Okay? Now, let's take these values, and we'll look at that more in just a second. Let's take these values and put them in our table. Tangent of 0, again, was 0. Tangent of pi over 4 was 1. This guy's undefined. This guy's negative 1. This guy's 0. Then we go 1, undefined, negative 1, and 0. Now, no problem. 0, 0 is right here. Pi over 4, 1. Where would pi over 4 be? If you look right here, it's going to be halfway in there, right? So pi over 4, 1 would be right there. So we've got to put a point there. Now, at pi over 2, it's undefined, so our graph's not going to go there. 3 pi over 4 would put you halfway in between here. And that is negative 1. And then pi is 0. And then 5 pi over 4 puts you at 1. We can't hit 3 pi over 2 because it's undefined. 7 pi over 4 would put you somewhere in there, in between there, which is negative 1. And you're starting to see a pattern, right? 0, and then 1 again. Come back this way, right? And you can probably already see the pattern, right? But at negative pi over 4, you have to do some thinking, but go back up to the unit circle. That would put you right here. So we're at negative 1. And then just keep following the pattern. Can't hit negative pi over 2. You can look at the unit circle and figure out why. But it ends up being like this. So All right, so what's going on? We can't hit pi over 2. That creates what we're going to define in a second as an asymptote. That means the graph cannot hit this value, right? It kind of creates a barrier for the tangent graph. It can't actually get there, okay? So remember, we're just sketching these, and we've plotted all the points that are nice, pretty whole numbers that are easy to graph, right? So what you could do at this point, remember pi over 2 is 90 degrees. What you could at this point is keep plugging in numbers. Pi over 4, which is right here, is 45 degrees. So keep plugging in angle measures for tangent in your calculator, right? Tangent of 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 80, 85 degrees, and keep plugging those in. And what you're going to find is that these values really start to explode up, right? You're going to get bigger and bigger numbers the whole time that you do that, which means that this graph is going to come up here, and while it can't touch pi over 2, it's going to get really big the closer we get to it. And you could do the same thing the other way, but what you're going to find is your values get really, really small the closer you get to negative pi over 2. And so our graph looks like that. And you can repeat this pattern all the way. And so it creates our tangent graph. Okay, now notice some things. We want to notice some things. First of all, this is a positive function, right? A is positive. So we're going up and to the right, down and to the left. Also notice that our nice pretty points are zeros, ones, and negative ones for our output, for our y values, right? We're going to use that. And take a look at this. This is going to be kind of weird, right? Because we're using a tick mark here, 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 here. So we're putting tick marks in between the ones that are provided. That means that we get an asymptote, that wall, every 2 tick marks, and then 6 tick marks, right? Because here's the next asymptote, which is 6 tick marks over. Same thing the other way, in the negative direction, we get 2 tick marks, 6 tick marks away. We're going to keep our asymptotes there, even if the period changes, right? Even if we compress or condense this, we're going to keep our asymptotes at the 2 tick mark, 6 tick mark thing, and just adjust our x-axis according to the period, okay? And try to keep this thing as consistent as we possibly can. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so we've already defined a couple of things. So here's your generalized tangent function, y equals a tangent bx, where a is still the amplitude. Amplitude, as you're going to find out in a second, is going to change where we put that point that was at 1 and negative 1. B is going to be the period. It still changes the period, right? First of all, vertical asymptotes. We're going to have vertical asymptotes at each end of the cycle, okay? Like I said, the asymptotes are going to be at 2 tick marks, 6 tick marks, and we'll walk through that. The next thing about the period, and we saw this, right? The tangent values repeat itself before sine and cosine does. It repeats itself every pi. So the period for tangent is actually pi. Okay? So the period is pi. We're always going to, where we were starting with 2 pi with sine and cosine before, we're going to start with pi now. Okay? And then when expanding or condensing, the period is pi over 2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time worrying about that. We're going to deal with expanding and condensing on our own. Okay? Let's graph. Next one. 2 tan x, right? So now our amplitude is 2. Okay, now we're still going to have an asymptote at 2 tick marks. I'm going to go ahead and make these asymptotes now. And then at 6 tick marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then in the other direction, it's the same thing. 2 tick marks, 6 tick marks. Okay? Now, the only thing that has changed is the amplitude. The period is still pi over 1, which is pi. The amplitude is 2. So this should look a lot like the first graph. So that means that our asymptote is at, so if period is pi, let's do it this way. If period is pi, then to come up with our tick marks, right, we're still going to try to label every 4 tick marks. Okay? But now our tick marks are going to go to pi instead of 2 pi. So pi over 4 is how much, we'll do it this way. To create our x values and our tick marks, we're going to take our period and divide it by 4. So that means we got 0, pi over 4, pi halves, 3 pi over 4, and pi. Okay? That means that this is going to be pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. It's awfully hard to put that in there, but that's how this is going to work. So I might just put pi over 2 and pi in here to make the graph a little bit easier to read. Right? So this is pi over 2, and then this guy is going to be pi. Okay? Now, at 0, tangent of 0 is still 0. 0 times 2 is 2. Tangent at pi over 4, which is this tick mark, and we can even use the table. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1, but then we got to multiply it by 2 because of the amplitude, and so this becomes just 2. So now this point goes at 2. Sorry about that. And then follow the pattern, right? That means this next point over here has got to be at negative 2. And then we're just going to repeat ourselves. 0, negative 2, 2. 0, negative 2, 2. Sorry about that, guys. Class just ended, school just ended, and so this is going to get a little noisy, but I'm going to keep going. Okay? And now that we have these plotted in, we can just make our curve, because we know what that curve looks like now. And put in as many cycles as we can fit. Right? Could even probably go one more over here if we wanted to. But our points are going to be at negative 2 and 2 instead of 1 and negative 1. Okay? So there's the graph of that guy. All right? All right. Let's see one where the period changes, right? Amplitude of this guy is 1. Period. We're going to divide into pi, not 2 pi, because again, tangent repeats itself every pi and not 2 pi. So we're going to divide it by b, so our period is pi over 4. So to create our x coordinates, we got to take pi over 4 and divide it by 4, which would give us pi over 16. So we're going to go 0, pi over 16, 2 pi over 16, which is pi over 8, 3 pi over 16, and then 4 pi over 16, which is pi over 4. Now, we're still going to create asymptotes at 2 tick marks and then at 6 tick marks on both sides. This is just to keep the graphing consistent. Okay? All right, sorry, so where was I? So we've made our x values here. We've placed our asymptotes at the second tick mark, 6th tick mark. All that's left is we can either label the x-axis or just, we already know what the graph is going to look like, right? So we go here and place these points. It's just one big pattern. And then we can fill them in. You can, again, show as many cycles as you want. But it's just going to repeat itself over and over. Okay? And so we label our x-axis, and that's how we show our period change. So now this guy is pi over 16, and I can't put these all in here. Next one's pi over 8. Next one's 3 pi over 16. And then pi over 4 is this guy. I mean, we could keep going. This is going to be 5 pi over 16, right? That's the next tick mark that goes here. 6 pi over 16 reduces to 3 pi over 8, which would go here. And then what is that? 7 pi over 16, which would go here. And then 8 pi over 16 is pi over 2, which would go there. Okay? Which kind of makes some sense. The first asymptote here is at pi over 8. Right? And if we plug pi over 8 in for x, we would get tangent of 4 times pi over 8, which reduces down, and you get tangent of pi over 2. What's tangent of pi over 2? It's undefined. So the asymptote needs to be there. Okay? So just a quick check to make sure that you've put the asymptote where you needed to put it. All right? Okay. Let's take a look at a graph like this, where we've got a negative tangent. What happens with those values, right? So we need the amplitude. Amplitude is still 1. I know it's negative. And then the period, which we're still going to take pi and divide it by a half, which when you flip this over and multiply, you get 2 pi. And to create your table, you got to take 2 pi and divide it by 4. So that means that every tick mark is going to be worth pi over 2. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, so on and so forth. So asymptotes at the second tick mark. That guy. That guy. And we're still going to create our graph. Now, there's a negative out front. Okay? So let's do this. 0, right? Tangent of 0. It's still, if you multiply it by a half, it's still going to be 0. Tangent at 0 is still 0. Right? So we're going to be right here. And then pi over 2, right? If I plug pi over 2 in for x, then we get tangent of pi over 4. Right? Tangent of pi over 4 is 1. You can verify that. But then we got to multiply it by a negative. So it becomes negative 1. So hold on a minute. And remember that each tick mark is worth pi over 2. Pi over 2 is right here. But pi over 2 is supposed to be negative 1. So right here. Well, that's interesting. If you plug in negative pi over 2, you're going to get tangent of negative pi over 4. Right? And this is going to get a little bit weird. But tangent at negative pi over 4, remember negative goes clockwise, it's going to put us in quadrant 4. The tangent there is negative 1. So tangent of negative pi over 4 is negative 1. But then you got to multiply it by another negative. So it would actually make it positive 1. So tangent at negative pi over 2 would make this positive 1. So what happened? The graph just kind of switched. And the same thing is going to happen in every other cycle. So the graph it will look like that. It just switches and goes up to the left, down to the right. Okay? One way to think about this is like a slope, right? Positive slope on lines means that you're going up and to the right. Negative slopes mean you're going down to the right. And that's kind of how this tangent graph works out. Okay? Everything else stays the same. The amplitude was 1, so we're going to go to 0, between 0, 1, and negative 1 for our values. And then, of course, we had to deal with the period change, which we do by just labeling the graph. So on and so forth. Okay? All right, hope that makes enough sense. We've got another one to graph here. Take a shot at graphing it, stop the video, try it, and then with what we've talked about, and then start the video back up and I'll show you what your graph should look like. Okay, so there you go. This is what your tangent should look like, right? So the period changes by a fourth. So your period now is 4 pi. That means that every one of your x values are going to be pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. And then your amplitude is 3. So your points had to go at 3 and -3. And since it's positive, it goes up to the right, down to the left. And you sketch your curve from there. Okay? Well, that makes enough sense. Now we got to deal with when we're shifting. Okay? And everything, the rules and the process is still the same. It's just we got to be careful. We got to try to figure out how to shift our asymptotes and all that kind of stuff, right? So here we go. Amplitude is 3. Period is still going to be pi because b is 1. Okay? That means for our x values, we're going to take pi and divide it by 4. So we go 0, pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, or pi halves, 3 pi over 4, and pi. 4 pi over 4, which is pi. Okay? Now, this guy still says shift down 2. This guy still says shift right. Right? I mean, this guy is going to be right. Pi over 4. We need to talk about it like that. So right pi over 4, which based on our tick mark values, does mean 1 tick mark. So I'll put that in parentheses. Okay? Now, everything's going to shift to the right pi over 4. Everything's going to shift to the right 1 tick mark, which means even our asymptotes. So asymptote was supposed to be at 2 tick marks, but now it's going to be at 3 because we had to shift it over 1. It was supposed to be at 6. Now it's going to be at 1, 2, 3, 4, at 7 tick marks because everything shifted over 1 to the right. That means that this guy is going to be an asymptote, and this guy is going to be an asymptote. Okay? Now, our graph still goes the same way. The amplitude is positive 3. So we're still going to go right in the middle of the period and be at 0. And then graph our amplitude going up to the right, down to the left. And we're still going to plot those points the same way we did before. It's just that everything has shifted over 1. Okay? All that's left from here is to label the x-axis so that we can kind of keep an eye on the values there. So 0, so this is going to be pi over 4. This is going to be pi over 2. This is 3 pi over 4. And this is pi. Okay? And you can always check, right? 3 pi over 4 is supposed to be an asymptote. Right? That's because if I plug in 3 pi over 4 for x, now subtract a pi over 4 from it, you get 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2, and tangent at pi over 2 is undefined. I don't even care about the rest of this stuff. Right? So that it makes sense that the asymptote is there. Okay? Now, hopefully 1's enough, right? Try this guy and see if you can't come up with the graph. Stop the video, and I'll show you what you should get. And here it is, right? So we're going to shift. Oh, you know what? I blew it. Let's go back. Let's go back. We were supposed to shift down 2. I didn't shift down 2 here. So I'm going to create a different color to show you what the graph actually should be. So we shifted everything to the right, but every point needs to go down 2 now. That's my fault. Okay. I blew that one. Okay. So now your actual graph should be the purple. I forgot the easier part here, which is shifting down. Okay. So if you were thinking that while I was doing it, then you're right. All right. Now try 7. Then I'll show you and if you, and then I'll show you what you should get. And we'll talk through it. Stop the video and then start it back up. And this is your graph, right? All right, so we're shifting up 1 because of that. We're shifting left pi over 2. Now, the amplitude is 1. Period is still pi because b is 1. Your x values are going to come from pi over 4. So you go 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. Right? And you see them labeled there. So you're shifting left pi over 2, which is going to be 2 tick marks, right? Because pi over 2 is at the second tick mark when we label the x-axis. So that means that every asymptote needs to move over 2 places from where they were originally. So instead of at 2, tick mark's going to be or your asymptote's going to be at 4, and then at 8 instead of 6. And then on the y-axis instead of at 2 to the left, right? And so on and so forth. And so that's why the asymptotes are where they are. Okay? You can see where the tangent points were plotted, and then you shift everything over to the left 2 tick marks, or to the left pi over 2, but then everybody had to go up 1 as well, which is why if you kind of set a new horizontal axis, you've got points on that axis and then 1 above, 1 below, just like before. Okay? All right. Hope that makes enough sense. If not, come in and see me and we'll straighten it all out. Homework's out in Canvas. Get it done by next time.